But what I want to talk a little bit about today is the project that we have been putting together on self-control, linking of self-motivation and virtue, which myself and Thomas are co-PIs with other team members in philosophy and economics, mathematics, and law, both in the US and in Brazil. Okay, so what is the project and why does it matter? Out there, when we're out in the world experiencing our day-to-day lives, we're constantly encountering situations in which virtue is called for, right? Situations in which we are asked to be more honest, perhaps, than we would want to be, kind when we're not particularly feeling like it, compassionate, generous, and of course, a question that's of central interest to all of us and has been of interest to us long before situationist worries came into the forefront of our discussions is how do the situations that we encounter in our day-to-day life that require some sort of virtuous response, how do those get linked up in any reliable way with actually virtuous appropriate responses? How do we link up the need for, the calling for virtue in the world around us to actual virtuous behavior? And there's a lot of different pieces of the architecture that are going to go into this story, such as our beliefs, like the extent to which we actually think that a virtuous response is called for, that a situation is unjust, or that someone deserves kindness, our affective states, feeling indignant at something that we see, or feeling compassion for the pain that somebody else is experiencing. But the piece of the architecture that we're particularly interested in is what we might call, broadly speaking, motivational states that we have. One of the types of motivational states that's been coming up a lot during this conference is values, right? So the states that orient us towards being virtuous in the world, that motivate virtuous behavior, and these are important for a variety of reasons. One, they create a sort of normative pressure. So to borrow from a previous talk yesterday, they increase the pressure towards integrity, right? So to the extent that we value certain ways of being in the world, they increase the likelihood that we will align our other values. We will engage in behaviors that facilitate the development of those values and the expressions of those values in a way that increases the underlying integrity of our psychological architecture. They help to increase cross-situational consistency. If it matters to me whether or not I'm being a decent person, I'm striving to be a better person, I want to be honest to the people around me, then it's going to encourage cross-situational consistency, because I will be more sensitive to situations in which honesty is called for, and I will be more inclined to recognize that this is something that I need to do. It increases the salience of the stimuli, what we're calling virtue-relevant stimuli in the environment. It makes it more salient to me when situations come up in which I need to behave in a virtuous manner. And it also, of course, thinking about it from a philosophical perspective, it helps us determine when our actions are in fact genuinely virtuous, in the sense that the motivations are the right sorts of reasons. We're not only doing the right thing, but we're doing it for the right sorts of reasons, because we value those sorts of things. So when we're talking about motivational states, there's going to be a variety of different types of motivational states. At the most basic level, we might talk about desires, right? And this is something that we're going to see even in very young children, thinking about it developmentally. The desire to, or we might potentially substitute or include in there this sense of need, perhaps, right? This desire to belong, the desire to get along with others, to be loved and to love others, and this by itself can orient us towards the world in a way that increases the frequency of virtuous behaviors, or proto-virtuous behaviors, if you prefer. Being helpful, being compassionate and empathic towards others. But then this will develop into something a little bit more robust, like values. So we saw the presentation at the end yesterday discussing the development of values within young children, where it's not simply a desire to be, to be compassionate or to make somebody feel better, but a value that we have, that this is something that we actually think is important. We prioritize it. in terms of the extent to which we think this is something we want to spend our time doing or that we care about developing. And then ultimately, the things that we value become prioritized into structures like goals, right? So that we have the goal to act in a particular way in the world or a goal to become better in some way. And then we might think of it in terms of long-term commitments. So what happens is that as these motivational structures develop, we're creating a broader, more comprehensive structure to operate within. And it's not just that it encompasses a wider variety of circumstances, but also gets extended through time. So when we have the commitment, for example, to be, I'm thinking of Valerie's personal projects inventories, like the idea of wanting to be a better person, right? That's something that we then extend forward into time. It's something that we're working on over a long period of time. And that continues to keep us oriented towards and sensitive to the ways in which our behaviors are aligned or not in alignment with those values. Now, in order for these motivational structures to orient us in the right way towards virtue, some of them are going to have to be what we're calling virtue-oriented, in the sense that they have to actually have virtue as their goal, as the thing that they're projected towards. So we have to, whether it's explicitly recognizing a certain virtue as being something that we want to develop, or more implicitly valuing that virtue and having that orient us towards it, some of these values, or some of these motivational states are going to be oriented specifically towards the virtues, okay? And this gets incorporated into our overarching self-identity, the extent to which we identify ourselves as having these attributes or desiring to have these attributes, and then into the larger narrative structure that we're working within, the stories that we tell about who we are, you know, the groups that we belong to, the community that we value being a part of, and where we're going in our lives in the future. Okay, so why this project matters is because I think it helps us to get clearer on the identifying and understanding how the underlying motivational structure works that unites our capacity to perceive the need for virtue in the world and our ability to actually respond appropriately to the call for virtue in the world. And it helps to give us a sense of the way in which character can become a dispositional structure, right? That it can actually provide consistency in our behavior across time and across a variety of situations. Okay, so methodology. We have a couple different objectives. I'm going to talk about two, and then Thomas will talk about two. So the first is to develop measures that provide insight into the underlying motivational structure of the development of virtue and virtuous character, the cultivation of character. And here, I think we need to start with an examination of self-regulatory measures, generally speaking. And of course, there's a huge variety of different types of regulatory structures. People talk about self-control, delayed gratification, locus of control, intentional self-regulation, willpower, all these different constructs. And I think one of the first places that we want to start is in trying to understand how these different regulatory mechanisms work, how they're related to one another, and the extent to which they co-predict certain sorts of responses. So ultimately, we'll probably end up developing a measure that incorporates different aspects of different types of self-regulatory measures that seem to be operating together. And then the next step would be to look at the various ways in which people incorporate virtue-oriented motivational structures into both their goals, their values, goals, and commitments, that sort of structure, the projection into the sort of person that the sorts of things they value and the sort of person that they want to be, and the extent to which virtue-oriented attributes are part of their self-identity. And there's a variety of different ways that these things can be measured, some of which have been talked about today and yesterday. The difference between explicit versus implicit values, and there's a number of different strategies for measuring those, some of which, especially on the implicit side, some of which are easier to do but potentially problematic, some of which are like the thematic apperception test, for those of you who might know what that is, are much more complicated, perhaps a bit more comprehensive. Also looking at the extent to which they are automatic, so looking at chronic accessibility and things like that, the extent to which people just automatically access certain sorts of virtue-oriented goals or identity attributes as opposed to come to them a little bit more effortfully. And then reminiscent of Holy cow, really? Okay. It always happens. So looking also at the extent to which they are recognized as core to who we are or tangential. Okay, so I better start speeding forward. One of the thoughts that we had is that we would expect that our capacity for general self-regulation, so the self-regulatory capacities that are themselves not necessarily virtuously oriented, are going to be related to virtue-oriented regulation in a number of ways, one of which is that the extent to which you're capable of higher levels of regulation, we would expect that you're going to generate more virtue-oriented regulation. And also the extent to which virtue-oriented values are present within you, that's going to activate a higher level of self-regulatory mechanisms. And if you care about being honest, then it's going to make it you're more likely that you'll access regulatory mechanisms to facilitate that sort of response. When it comes to the link between virtue-relevant stimuli and virtue-appropriate responses, the expectation is that these the virtue-oriented regulatory capacities, identifying ourselves as having certain virtue-oriented values and goals and identities, are going to end up doing most of the work. So the more that we have these sorts of virtue-oriented regulatory capacities, the less we'll be relying on the general self-regulation to be able to facilitate the connection between what we perceive as needed in the world and what we actually do. So our responses become less effortful and more robust and automatic precisely because the regulatory mechanisms are becoming embedded in our virtue-oriented values, goals, and identity. Okay. The second objective is to look at the role of narrative structure, and I'm going to just speed through this since I've gone way too long. But obviously, the values and goals that we have and the identity that we form are going to be captured within a larger narrative structure of who we are, the life that we're living, the part of the community that we are embedded in, the significance of the choices that we're making, and that these are important because they provide an organization or a hierarchy of the sorts of things that we ought to value and orient ourselves to, and a way of making sense of the choices that we're making and the reasons that we have for action. So we want to look at the role of personal narratives in both facilitating our sensitivity to relevant stimuli in the environment, the sensitivity that we have to the fact that virtue is called for, and our willingness and our engagement in virtue-appropriate responses. And there's a variety of different types of narratives that we could look at, a number of which have been talked about during the conference, and also different methodologies for getting at those narratives, some of which are going to involve naturalistic observations and others more experimental designs. And then we've been developing a textual analysis process. We've been doing some research on humility and using textual analysis, computational processes to look at these differences in humble versus non-humble writings. We could use something very similar here for high levels of virtue orientation versus lower levels. And so sorry.
Yeah, it's all right. I had 5 and then 3, and then I just got the sign for 2, so I'm going to do this in 30 seconds, and then you guys can ask questions later. So no, that's totally fine. The stuff you did first was more important. So the third objective, which is really just building on the first two, assuming we want to take our findings that we get from the first two objectives and see whether or not they're cross-culturally stable. That's probably obvious enough. If you have more questions, we can answer those in the Q&A. Why Brazil? There were both empirical reasons and practical reasons. Empirical reasons having to do with existing studies having already found interesting differences in terms of moral psychology. These I'm just going to skip between American populations and Brazilian populations. Some of Haidt's early work on the moral foundations was done down there. So we have sort of empirical motivations. More importantly, we also have some practical considerations. We have colleagues that we've already worked with. We already have sort of people on the ground that are willing to help us both in terms of accessing populations in the universities down there and in accessing populations in the favelas. And we also have some graduate students who are willing to both help us translate and back translate the work, our materials. So that's the third objective. And here again, we're really just looking to see whether or not we can replicate or we find cross-cultural differences. Skip to objective 4. This one's going to have to be going faster. So the developmental narrative here, a lot of talk has already been had the last 2 days about using expressive writing therapy or even narrative writing therapy, which hasn't been talked about quite as much. Usually those are therapeutic, right? I mean, it's the therapeutic part. You're trying to figure out whether you can take people and make them well, or you take people who have post-traumatic stress disorder and minimize the effects. And what we're interested in is whether or not we can use these sorts of expressive writing therapies or narrative writing therapies have already been developed to try to inculcate virtuous behavior in children and at-risk children in particular. We have 2 groups. I'll just finish up. We have 2 groups already, middle school, early childhood programs in Charleston, and they're already doing this sort of work, but not with these sort of narrative therapies we're hoping to develop. This part of the project would grow out of the textual analysis that Jen mentioned at the very, very end of what she was just saying, and so that's the sort of way to get from here to there. Sorry.
Thank you.
Very interesting. I'm curious about what is the sort of relative priority or proportionality between self-control as the mechanism and value structures, or I mean motivational structures broadly.
Well, I mean, so if by self-control you mean the more general regulatory capacities that were in the top box, right?
Yeah.
Okay. So my guess is that first of all, the virtue-oriented regulatory capacities, I would say, are going to be a form of control, right? They're regulatory capacities. They don't come across as effortful because they are incorporated into the architecture of the self, right? So, I mean, that's in the talk yesterday. Someone mentioned the fact that socialization, this idea of socialization and taking in culture is a relatively empty term unless we understand the mechanisms by which it happens. And the argument that we'd want to make is that it's by virtue of incorporating certain values and goals and into our personal structure, the structure of our personality and our sense of ourself and the larger narrative that we're part of, that happens. That's what socialization, or at least in part what socialization is. So the more effortful regulatory capacities like delayed gratification and just general capacity to control oneself are going to matter most at 2 places. One, at the early stages of that sort of socialization and incorporation, right? So as I'm, for example, as an adult, if I'm deciding that I want to cultivate a virtue, then I'm going to have to engage a lot of regulatory capacities to orient myself in that way because it's not natural for me to do so. Right, I want to change my personality, I'm going to have to use the regulatory capacities. But then as those values, as that becomes a part of my sense of who I am and what I value, my goals that I have, what I'm oriented towards, then the regulatory capacities will cease to be as important because it becomes a much more automatic part of how we function. And it's interesting because at the same time, the fact that I value it, the fact that it's something that is of importance to me is going to make the self-regulatory capacities more available precisely because at this moment it's going to be hard for me to be virtuous, but I care about it. And so I'm going to actually be able to activate more regulatory capacities the more I value it. So the values end up playing 2 roles in that sense, making the self-regulatory capacities less necessary, but the same also more available, if that makes sense.
That makes a lot of sense. That's it's very thoughtful. And so then in your methodology, in the studies that you'll be doing, what portion of the time will you be spending on both categories?
Well, it depends in part on how messy, I mean, the self-regulatory stuff is really messy. So the hope is that we'll be able to narrow in on a number of different ways of measuring self-regulation that fit together well and make sense, that we can then use to examine how those are related to virtue-oriented motivations, people's goals and their values and their self-identity. The hope is that part will be relatively straightforward. So the first few months of the 2 years, really focusing on that, and then looking at how that's related to people's values and goals and their self-identity, and the extent to which that is expressed implicitly and explicitly, both in and of itself and then within the larger narratives that we'll have them work on.
Doug.
Focusing in on the comparison between US and Brazil, for example, I wonder if you could elaborate a bit on what really are your hypotheses that you would expect, why would there be differences or similarities for that matter between these 2 countries? And how are you going to test those hypotheses more specifically?
Okay.
Well, so part of this has to do with this notion of self-regulation that we're saying is at the heart of maybe part of the core piece of moral development. And part of this is driven by the fact that we already find in the World Value Survey that you find these differences in their attitudes and beliefs precisely where we would expect them, we were wanting to find differences, which is to say have things having to do with how much choice they have over their lives, how much they think their lives are driven by luck, so these sorts of factors. So we already have some survey data, not ours of course, that suggests we're going to find these differences just about how they view themselves in relation to the world. So there's already like some self-based differences. And then you also find the differences, like I said, there's data that Brazilians are more collectivists in general than Americans. There's data they have different negotiating styles, height found differences in how their sort of basic moral foundations operated. And so I guess based on the fact that we already find all these differences, we predict that if it turns out that our results are cross-culturally stable, this will be a good test for whether they are in fact cross-culturally stable. There are enough differences that if it is a function of a cultural artifact, we should find it by using Brazilians. I mean, why not Chinese? I mean, there are a bunch of different ones we could have used, but we just figured there's enough difference already, I think, in the literature to suggest that this is a place where we'd find them if there were.
If they're there.
So,
and then we have the practical reality of having
we-
team members that are there that we can work with.
But the hypothesis is that, I mean, I'd like to think that the results we find are cross-culturally stable. So the hypothesis is, yes, these parts of the results are going to be cross-culturally stable. That's what I'd like to be the case.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, we might find some differences around the edges, but like the core of what we find here, I'd like to think we find there. Yeah.
Just quickly, there might be, one of the places that we might find differences is the extent to which which regulatory mechanisms are most enhanced or emphasized within the culture, and how narratives get, how they get constructed. The sorts of the places where people place emphasis in terms of self in relationship to other, which then might end up facilitating the emphasis on different virtues, different constellations of values and goals. That sort of thing might be different, but then the underlying way in which those work together should be, we're hoping, would be stable.
So
and we would test that by using the same processes in both populations. Like the same methods would be used in both places.
So we find the same you might find the same underlying architecture and mechanisms. You might just find some local differences.
Right.
Yeah.
Does that
My-
make sense? Yeah.
My question is about, it seems that you have a notion of self-control, at least the way you describe it, as a static variable, as a trait, whereas there's lots of data to show that, the aggressive kids, for example, are only aggressive and out of control in
Sure.
threatening situations. Or PTSD folks, it's threatening situations that make them lose their self-control. So I was just wondering if you're going to look at situational variability, if there's any way in your design to do that.
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure, and I didn't mean to assume that it's, these are regulatory capacities, not so much traits specifically, right? So they're very different sorts of things. But the idea would be that there's going to be individual differences in the extent to which one can facilitate, can activate self-regulatory capacities when you're confronted with situations in which a virtuous response is called for.
And
so
you're
we would
putting
wanna
them
look at
into
the-
situations?
Sorry?
Are you putting them into situations?
Yeah, so there's a variety of different things that we're looking at. One would be to give them, to have them talk about situations in which they've encountered, so using some sort of self-reports of their own actual experiences, using hypothetical experiences that they're having to try to determine how they would respond, and then of course doing experimental manipulations where they're put in situations where they have to respond, and looking at variability. So yes, and also probably some sort of experimental sampling of one form or another where we're trying to get at naturalistic, their daily experiences with situations in which they recognize that they are, that there's a response that they need to give, and can they do it or not.
Okay, so you are going to be looking at people who are directly aiming at a virtue as a goal for their personal development, or are you going to be casting your net more widely to look at people who might have virtue-relevant goals, such as being a good parent, which might indirectly develop a virtue, or both?
Right. Both.
Okay.
Yeah.
Good.
Yeah.
Glad to hear that. And
Yay.
we
Yeah.
are out of time, so thank you very much.